Okay. Some images from Dien Bien Phu. Whoops. Well, we'll just do it that way then. Again, there's Ho and Jap preparing strategy with a model of Dien Bien Phu. It's kind of an analog. In 1968, there's a famous photo of LBJ looking at a model of Khe Sanh. And in fact, in 68, well, I'm getting way ahead of the game here, when the PAVN lays siege to Khe Sanh, LBJ orders a bunch of studies of Dien Bien Phu because he thinks that's what they're trying to do again, to recreate that. There's a Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu as they overrun French positions. French parachuting their supplies, and again, French superiority. Some more images here. Remember I mentioned napalm. There's a photo there of some French soldiers passing a Viet Minh napalm victim. Okay. There's French soldiers in their bunker at Dien Bien Phu. You can tell it's fairly stark, fairly brutal landscape. De Castries bunker. These are more recent photos. And Dien Bien Phu has become a historical site, like the Alamo or something like that. De Castries bunker, which is where the surrender took place. There's a Viet Minh cemetery at Dien Bien Phu, and then kind of their wall. There is a wall at Dien Bien Phu with the names of Vietnamese who were killed in that battle. Okay, so for the Vietnamese, Dien Bien Phu has historical legacy, not unlike something like the Alamo would, or Antietam, or whatever. Okay. So with Dien Bien Phu, then the Vietnamese oust the colonial invaders like they have many, many times before. And this is a great victory for Ho and for Jap. There's something else. I just added this because I've only recently come across it. Some folks are starting to study aspects of the Vietnamese War that they hadn't before. And one of them, which I found very interesting, was the role of Japanese in Vietnam. And I just want to briefly talk about that because there was a significant Japanese contribution to the Viet Minh, which I really never had known about. In 1945, remember, Japan had gone in and occupied Indochina, but then Japan loses after Hiroshima. A lot of Japanese deserters, however, stay on in Vietnam, and they end up playing a very important role with the Viet Minh. Over 5,000 Japanese deserters remain in Vietnam at the end of the Second World War, and a good number, majority of them, join the Viet Minh. Many of them played an important role in fighting with the Viet Minh and establishing officers' training schools, elite combat units, mining. Some had pharmaceutical backgrounds. Some were able to set up kind of economic organizations and things like that. They served as advisors and whatnot. So there was really a vital Japanese role. This is interesting, especially, I think, because it harkens back to the kind of stuff, remember, Phan Boi Chau and Phan Chu Trinh talked about the Travel East movement and the Association for the Modernization of Vietnam to kind of play on this kind of Asian model. And you see elements of that too. Even though the Japanese were very brutal, a terribly brutal occupying force, there was something of a perverse admiration because they could be Western, they could be modernized. Clearly the most advanced Asian country. Okay? And so those Japanese who stay behind really play a vital role because they're looked up to. I mean, the Japanese, military, even though it lost the war, really was by far the most dominant military in Asia. And so, given the fact that the Viet Minh and the Vietnamese are in trouble after World War II, I mean, they've been occupied, millions are dead because of famine, the whole country is in a fairly fragile state. Ho and Jap and the Viet Minh look to the Japanese as a kind of a stopgap savior almost. We're in this disarray, and the Japanese can really help us out. They can help us fight a war against the French. After all, the Japanese, just fought a war against the Americans. They're used to fighting these Western powers, and even though they lost, it was, still fairly impressive the way they tried to create this greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. A lot of the arms that the Viet Minh first had actually were given to them by the Japanese in the fall of 1945. The Viet Minh also obtained some weapons on the black market from overseas Chinese traders in places like Haiphong and the Saigon area, but also from Japanese officers who had sold them on the black market. a lot of the weapons, it's kind of ironic, the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong would often use weapons that they did not produce or manufacture, of course, and really which did not come from the Soviet Union or China. In the first war, they got a lot of Japanese weapons, and in the second war, they got a lot of American weapons, black market or taken from the ARVN or whatever. Okay, so Japan had a vital role to play actually in arming the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh also were impressed that the Japanese tended to be versed in modern military techniques. They were tactically expert. They understood how to use weapons and technology far better than the Vietnamese did. And so the Vietnamese quite admired the Japanese, and the Japanese played a vital role in that. The first contacts actually came through Japanese officers. The most famous was a Japanese officer who was also, a scholar, an intellectual, a military intellectual named Kiyoshi Komatsu. And he worked very closely during the occupation with Vietnamese groups who were pro-independence. So even though he was Japanese, he was in close contact with Viet Minh types in the South. And after the war ended, this Japanese officer actually created a committee for to get international support, especially from other Asians, for the Viet Minh. So he would actually make contacts throughout Japan and elsewhere to try to get support. So the Viet Minh, again, this ties into the larger Cold War. Just as Asians, even though Japan was doing cruel things, could look with some pride upon the Japanese as having kind of a modern power, other Asians were looking at the Viet Minh as being a country or a movement, I'm sorry, which spoke to issues of concern to them. So even though other Asians may not really know a whole lot about Vietnam, they would see Ho Chi Minh's struggle as part of their own struggle against the West, against white colonialism, and they would support it. And so you have Japanese officers who are really helping organize groups like this. There are Japanese diplomats who remain behind, who work with the Viet Minh to try to secure international support and international recognition. They tried to bring other Japanese deserters into the Viet Minh movement. And so by the time the wars begin in late 1946, after the shelling of Haiphong, the Japanese have a very vital role to play. Many of them are officers. The Vietnamese use a lot of Japanese soldiers in the front line because they are tactically expert. During one battle in early 1947 near Hue, the French said that they had come across a unit made up entirely of Japanese deserters, of about 150 soldiers, and the Japanese actually wiped out the French. They were that good, and Japanese officers often trained the Viet Minh. Because of this, the Japanese were treated better. In fact, whereas a Vietnamese soldier got about $10 a month, a Japanese soldier earned $30 in a month, and a Japanese officer would get $80 a month. And in the first 2 or 3 years of the war, when the Viet Minh had been decimated by the war and the famine and everything else, the Japanese really helped them create an army almost out of nothing. By the later 40s, the Viet Minh is a fairly formidable force by 1950, and the Japanese aren't as important. But I think it's first of all, it's kind of neat to find out stuff like this that you didn't really know before. But it also gives a larger international dimension to the whole Vietnam War, which I think is really important more and more. And I'll talk more about this later on. We started to see Vietnam as an international war. And when you see stuff like that, it really hits home how these thousands and thousands of Japanese who were the occupying army in Vietnam stayed behind and actually helped build up the Viet Minh, helped them fight, helped them organize their diplomatic corps, helped them organize Japanese accountants, helped put the economy together. Japanese miners and clerks and things like that became important bureaucrats. So again, Asians see this as part of a larger struggle. In the 60s, Japanese students often took to the streets to demonstrate against the American war in Vietnam. So again, this is the Vietnamese-American war, but there's all kinds of other stuff going on there, all kinds of larger issues. And that's one thing that in the last few years has really been interesting. And in the Reader, there are a couple articles on China and the Soviet Union, which I think are really valuable. When we get to those, to see this as part of a much larger struggle, to see this within the context of global politics and of especially the Cold War. And so this idea that the Japanese contributed in the early years through all these deserters is really quite remarkable and really adds a new layer to our understanding of Vietnam. And again, it shows that the context, it's not just France and Vietnam, it's not just the United States and France, it's much, much larger than that. So there's a lot more going on. Okay. Okay, now we're going to start talking about the kind of meat and potato stuff, why the U.S. gets involved in Vietnam in a very specific way, first with significant economic aid and ultimately with military support and troops. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the United States essentially stepping into Vietnam as the French return. And I'm going to do this, first of all, there's going to be an overriding theme, which is building a liberal world. I'll talk a little bit about liberalism, because you can't really talk about the world after 1945 without talking about liberalism. Then I want to give you 3 specific reasons for American involvement in Vietnam. One has to do with containment in Europe, another has to do with communism in Asia, and a third has to do with global capitalism. Okay? First, you already know the United States essentially acquiesces to the French return, even though during the war, Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had issued rhetoric about anti-colonialism. In fact, the United States wasn't going to jeopardize its relationships with European powers by taking a hard line on their return to their colonies. So the British in India, the French in Indochina, the French in Algeria, wherever. The United States may issue lip service, which is a term often used, but it's not going to make a stand and say, no, you can't go back to Indochina, give the British, Indians immediate independence, you know, let Egypt go. No, you're not going to hear anything like that. Right? So once France returns, because it has its own imperial pretensions, it has investments in Indochina, the United States is going to basically step aside and let the French return, but also step in and support the French return. Why does it do this? Well, the overarching reason is because the United States was embarked on a great crusade to build a liberal world, and it had been throughout the 20th century. What is liberalism? Liberalism is not what you think it is today. I mean, today liberalism means, I'm not sure, frankly, what it means anymore. I guess it means you want to, you know, tax and spend money and give it to poor people who don't want to work and make sure everybody in the world has an abortion. That's kind of what liberalism is caricatured as today. All right? It means something very specific, and it has a unique historical meaning, though. Liberalism is the dominant political economic ideology of the 20th century. It emerges really out of Adam Smith and people like that. And it becomes the dominant world ideology in the early 1900s because capitalism becomes global. Liberalism essentially means open trade, the open door, free markets, globalization. Along with that, it means political reform along democratic lines. It means something you pointed out early on. It means you develop and reform a society to develop a middle class within that society. You educate your people. So it's free trade, open markets, political reform. All of these things constitute a liberal world. The goal is to reform the world along American lines, make it safe for free trade. When Woodrow Wilson in World War I said the world must be made safe for democracy, this is what he was talking about. Not necessarily that everybody could vote. Basically what Wilson meant was that the world had to open its doors to trade, that every country should be able to invest and get markets and get consumers. And at the same time, those countries which were underdeveloped needed to reform themselves so that they would develop a middle class, a group of consumers, a group of elites who could then negotiate with countries, elites in other areas, and develop economic institutions there too. William Allen Williams, famous radical historian, called it the imperialism of idealism. Not only was it free trade imperialism, opening these countries' markets to the U.S. to free trade, but also creating kind of a progressive ideal in these countries so that they could negotiate and operate and relate to us economically on more advanced terms. This is what liberalism is. After World War II, it means you have to find new markets. Nobody wants a repeat of the 1930s. They were catastrophic. Global depression, which gives rise to Hitlerism in Germany and all kinds of other social problems. Nobody wants a repeat of that. You're also aware after World War II that anti-colonialism is becoming a stronger and stronger force. And a lot of these anti-colonial movements are going to organize along socialist lines, like Ho Chi Minh is, okay? Like, even though Mossadegh and Arbenz really were not socialists, that's the fear there, that's the impression you get there. So you absolutely have to create a liberal world. You have to increase trade and open markets all over because you don't want a repeat of the 1930s. But you also have to encourage reform. Now this is where it gets dicey because isn't that what Ho Chi Minh's doing? Isn't he encouraging reform? Isn't he trying to modernize Vietnam in a sense? it doesn't matter because he's not doing it along lines of the American model. Okay? So the overarching concern after World War II is going to be to build a liberal world. Okay? And that includes Vietnam. Now, as part of this liberal world, you have to contain communism, you have to maintain capitalist strong points, and you have to make sure, to use the language of dependency, that the core and periphery are working in sync with each other. The core are the great powers, the industrial producers, the United States, of course, the British, the French, the Germans, and so forth. The periphery, the underdeveloped nations, those nations which supply labor and raw materials, the Latin America or Asia, right? You have to make sure that they work in sync, they understand their place in the world. This is what a liberal world is, okay? A liberal world is not what the Nazis had in mind because they were trying to close off Europe. They wanted to dominate Europe and keep everybody else out. National socialism. I mean, think of that term, National Socialism. We always talk about Nazi. We don't think about the term National Socialism, which really indicates in a very succinct way what the Germans were trying to do. They were trying to create a socialist society nationally, internally, so you would not have any needs for outside markets. They wanted to control the resources and the markets of Europe. Nobody else would be allowed in, and they wouldn't have to go outside that. That's what the Japanese are doing in the Pacific. The Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere is an attempt to close off Asia to outside forces, to Westerners, to Caucasians. All right? So both Germany and Japan pose the same threat. They are illiberal. They are, I mean, that's what fascism is. Fascism isn't liberalism. Fascism is a closed society. A liberal society is open, not just in terms of political institutions, because those are variable, in terms of trade, in terms of economic access. And this is the key to post-World War II reconstruction efforts, to create a liberal world, to maintain a free flow of goods and trade. This is why the United States establishes the Marshall Plan. This is why the United States pours billions of dollars into Germany and Japan. You know, I remember in the 70s when, you know, the Japanese automakers started entering the American market, and Americans are losing their jobs in Detroit and places like that, and there's kind of a hue and cry, you know, we saved them after World War II, we bailed them out, and this is what we get in return. That wasn't done out of, you know, to be a nice guy. This was part of an effort to create a larger liberal world, and the integration, the reintegration of Japan and Germany into the world economy were crucial to that. And Vietnam plays a role in that too, even though it's a small country that's not terribly important. So the overarching principle is that the United States wants to create a liberal world, a global liberal world after World War II, with reform, with free trade, with open markets, and so forth. Specifically, this means you have to contain communism, you have to maintain capitalist strongholds, all right? Containment, and these aren't the best maps, as initially, as I said, a European phenomena. And these essentially show you the way that Europe was divided after World War II, where you have the East, this kind of brownish area, which tends to be communist, split right there in half in Germany, and pretty much the same here. The maps aren't terribly different. Okay, and within that context, France's role in Vietnam is quite important. Remember, objectively, Ho Chi Minh had nothing against the United States. Ho had tried to make contacts with the Americans for some time, and in fact, during the war, remember, had been on good terms with the Office of Strategic Services. The Viet Minh had worked with the OSS to try to rescue down flyers and whatnot. And he had sent many notes to Truman in Washington trying to seek assistance, and Washington never even acknowledged him. One OSS agent said that Ho Chi Minh was an awfully sweet guy. So Ho had made overtures to the Americans, right? Despite that, however, the American goal of supporting the French and containing communism in Europe was more important. So even though Ho Chi Minh would write to FDR and Truman asking for support, he also realized that their interests were much larger than Vietnamese independence. The Vietnamese independence really wasn't on the radar screen. In fact, Ho says, the Americans are only interested in replacing the French. They want to reorganize our country and control it. They are capitalists to the core. And America's behavior essentially bears that out. the Americans were never thrilled that France was re-entering Vietnam, but they were not willing to risk their relationship with France in order to cause problems, because that might cause problems in Europe. After 1945, the U.S. is pursuing containment in Europe. It wants to keep that map essentially the way it looks. It doesn't want the brown to spread out any further into Germany, especially into France or Italy, countries which had strong socialist and labor movements. Right? France is essentially the keystone too. As France goes, so goes Europe, a lot of Americans would say. In order to pursue this kind of containment and not allow communism to spread any further to the West, then the United States needs the cooperation of all of these countries, the British, the Germans, and especially the French. Within France, the new president, Charles de Gaulle, is trying to both reestablish French prestige after the debacle of May and June of 1940, and also to keep the communists and the socialists inside France at arm's length, to keep them at bay. So if the United States says to the French, you don't need to go back in Indochina, that's a diversion, then they risk alienating de Gaulle and possibly strengthening the left inside of France. And this could then lead to the loss of the French in this fight against communism. So what they're afraid of is that if they cause France problems, if they say to the French, don't go back into Vietnam, France either will get ticked off and not be a valuable ally in the need to contain communism in Europe, or the French left may say the Americans have abandoned you, vote socialist, and in which turn de Gaulle would fall. So either way, the Americans don't believe that it's worth the risk. They will support the French because Europe is way more important. We want to keep France happy. We're not going to tell you not to go back to Vietnam, even though we know it's stupid. You know, Vietnam, who cares? You guys don't need that. Nonetheless, we're not going to tell you not to go back there because we want you to be happy. We want you to like us. We want to be on good terms with you because Europe is way more important. We want you to help us contain the Soviet Union. And if you're going to be happy by going back into Vietnam, then we're happy for you. You just remember to stay on our side. William Bundy, who would later be the Secretary of State for Far East, Assistant Secretary for Far Eastern Affairs, said that after World War II, it was clear that France was going to go back into Indochina, and Bundy said, if we said we won't help you in Indochina, I think it would have seriously reduced the chances of the effective organization and rearming of the NATO countries. So it tied into Europe in that way. Nobody wanted to alienate France and possibly make them an uneasy ally in Europe by telling them to stay out of Vietnam. So it was an easy call. This is clearly a no-brainer. You know, what's more important, Vietnamese independence or French containment? French containment, that's easy. French containment is far more important than Vietnamese independence ever will be. So because of that, then the United States encourages and supports France's return and then begins to send money and support and men and everything else like that in. Okay? In a similar way, not the best map in the world, but somewhat useful. In the same way, communism in Asia has an important role to play in this. Now, remember at first, as Kennan saw it, containment should have applied to Europe, but after that it expands into Asia. And just as containing the Soviet Union and Europe was crucial, rebuilding and maintaining Japan in Asia was crucial as well. From 1945 to 49, there are two major goals in Asia. One, to keep Japan free, capitalist, and rebuild it. The other, until October 1st, 1949, is to try to maintain a non-communist China. All right? These are the two goals, to keep Mao Zedong from winning and to keep Japan rebuilt and happy. Well, in Japan, the United States does a good job. Japan rebuilds. MacArthur comes in, essentially rides herd. They write a new constitution. Their economy develops, and by 1949, 1950, the Japanese are well on their way to recovery. But in China, it's a disaster, of course, because on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong wins control of the government. At the time, the population of China was about 500 million, so it's the biggest country in the world, is now communist. And one of the reasons the United States intervenes in Korea is to kind of send a signal to Mao Zedong that we will not allow you to turn this entire area into satellites of the Soviet Union. So if this map were red, their fear would be that these other countries would fall then to Chinese influence, and pretty soon all of Asia would be communist except for Japan. Do you want Japan to be isolated? No, you don't want Japan to be the only non-communist country in that area, both because it would be under attack and who would it trade with? All right? So because of that, then, the United States finds it imperative to support anti-communist elements in Vietnam because it does not want Japan encircled or dominated by communist countries. And if Vietnam goes communist and Laos goes communist and Cambodia goes communist, later on Eisenhower would coin the term the domino theory. He didn't really coin it. He was talking about how they would fall like dominoes. Okay? If all of these countries turn red, then only Japan's left. This is not good because Japan would be constantly threatened by its neighbors, which were all communist, and it wouldn't have anybody to trade with in Asia. And the key to Japanese economic revival is going to be the Asian economy. All right? So even though Ho Chi Minh may have had nationalist credentials, even though he had made overtures, he was seen as a puppet of the Chinese, of Mao Zedong. And the United States wanted to try to isolate China as much as possible. And since Vietnam was on China's border, it meant that we will support anti-communist elements in Vietnam in order to make sure that Japan ultimately is not surrounded by communist countries. Okay? The Chinese would often say the East is red, and people in America would respond, but the West is ready. And one of the reasons was Vietnam. They wanted to make sure that anti-communist elements in Vietnam were given a hearing. All right? Another reason, which is a little more complex but quite important, has to do with global capitalism. And we've kind of danced around this issue before, and a lot of the postings on the discussion list have talked about the economic role in Vietnam. And for somebody who accepts a predominantly economic interpretation or a principally economic interpretation, not exclusive but clearly most important role in American foreign policy being economic, you have to be careful about the way you talk about Vietnam. I mean, I believe the open door and liberalism are really crucial to understanding the way America acts in the world. But at the same time, America's economic stake in Vietnam is not terribly large. A little bit of interest in tin and tungsten and rubber, and things like that, but nothing terribly substantial. There's always been this kind of dream that great oil reserves could be found in the South China Sea, and there had been geological surveys and things made. But even to this day, it's still not clear whether they're there. I mean, in the 70s, there was a time when the American oil companies threw in the towel and said there's nothing there, and apparently they're going back now. They've done some new surveys, and there may be. But the fact of the matter is, in pure economic terms, Vietnam's not terribly important. I mean, had the United States never heard of Vietnam, the economy would not have changed a blip. Okay? Why then can you say that there was an economic interest driving the United States to intervene in Indochina? Well, it's a little more circular, but I think it's also very crucial, and it has to do, I think, with this idea of creating a liberal world. Just as Vietnam was really a pawn in European politics, France was more important. Just as it had a subordinate role in Asia, China and Japan are way more important. It's pulled into conflict economically, not because by itself it's important, because Vietnam isn't. It's because of America's larger goals in that region. As I said, when the United States looks at Asia after the war, there are two major goals. One, rebuild Japan along capitalist, pro-American lines. Two, contain communism, especially in China. Very simple. Rebuild Japan, keep China isolated. Okay? Those are America's two goals in Asia. And as I said before, they succeeded with the first one. Japan rebuilds, capitalist country, quite successful. In the second one, they fail miserably. Mao Zedong wins. All right? As a result, by 1950, the United States wants to keep Japan healthy. They want to keep its economy growing, and they want to make sure that the Chinese don't spread beyond that. In order to do that, one of the goals then will be to develop markets in Southeast Asia. Okay, in this area here, Southeast Asia would encompass Thailand, Myanmar, which is Burma, all the way down through Malaysia, there's a peninsula there, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. What's that? You can't see my finger? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, okay. Yeah, of course not. Duh. But you can see the cursor, right? So you can see this is the area, Southeast Asia, which is really crucial. The United States sees this as a crucial area for Japanese development. All right? The United States wants to develop markets throughout, not just Japan, not just in Japan, but throughout Southeast Asia. And if they can do that, they can keep, they believe, the Chinese at bay, and China won't be able to expand beyond its own borders. So Vietnam and Southeast Asia really are a keystone of America's policies. Now this is where it gets dicey, and it'll sound like you need a degree in economics to understand this, but you really don't. I'm going to go over some of this stuff, and if it sounds confusing, don't sweat it. All right, but it's worth mentioning. All right. After World War II, the biggest economic problem facing the United States is something that was called the dollar gap. Okay. The dollar gap. Right. Because the United States was the only country to come out of World War II in better shape than it started. Remember, the rest of the world is devastated. The U.S. economy is incredibly powerful at the end of World War II. It was producing more goods than the domestic market could absorb. Remember when I talked about the 1890s? The United States is making way more stuff than the American people can buy because it's producing for a global market because of the war. Well, now the war's over, and you don't have all those purchase orders coming in from these countries who need wartime supplies. Okay? So the United States finds itself producing now more than Americans can purchase. Now, normally in the 1890s, you would find overseas markets. You would find overseas consumers. There's a problem. There is a dollar gap. The Europeans, who are going to be your major market, do not possess enough money, enough dollars to purchase American goods. As a result of something in 1944 called the Bretton Woods system, the dollar is established as the world currency, and there's a gold standard. This is in 44. The Bretton Woods system establishes the dollar as the world currency backed by gold. Any country that has dollars can trade them in at the price of $35 per ounce of gold. Every currency in the world is pegged to the dollar, which is based on this gold standard. And currencies cannot be devalued. They do not fluctuate. They are fixed. Nowadays, you can look in the paper every day and you can see what the yen and the mark and the lira and the franc and the euro are, right? You couldn't do that in 45. Basically, you had the dollar and every country's currencies were pegged to that, and they did not move. All right? Other countries, especially European countries, lacked dollars. So the United States somehow needs to get dollars into foreign hands so they can in turn purchase American goods with it. One way of doing this is the Marshall Plan, right? Military spending programs where you send a ton of money to another country with the provision that they purchase goods made in America with it, especially military supplies. However, after 1948, Congress is not as excited about spending all this money on foreign aid. Right? Things like the Marshall Plan was $17 billion, which may not seem like a lot of money, but it's about a fifth of what Bill Gates is worth today. But in 1948, it's a lot of money, and it's a significant departure in terms of what the U.S. usually spends abroad. Paul Douglas, a senator from Illinois, once said, a billion here, a billion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. So $17 billion is real money in 1948 dollars. After the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan, helps Europe get back on its feet, and really the Soviet Union is pretty much not a threat in Western Europe after that. So the Marshall Plan works. So the American Congress is reluctant to keep pouring billions of dollars into Europe to get dollars into European hands so they can in turn use it to purchase American goods. But a lot of Americans are afraid that without some kind of subsidy, without some kind of European subsidy, then you're going to have a situation like the 1930s, where the Europeans will enact trade barriers and tariffs and things like that to keep American goods out, because America can produce stuff more cheaply, and you could have another depression on your hands. So the key problem then is how to get money to the Europeans so that they can purchase American goods and thereby help everybody. All right? Now, you know, that by itself makes some sense, but of course that's not all of it. It gets more complicated because Japan is part of this too. A minute ago we were talking about European reconstruction, but Japan is also a part of this. The United States is subsidizing Japanese reconstruction, but by 1950 the United States is trying to wean the Japanese off U.S. funding. And the key to that will be to connect Japan back to these other Asian countries. From 45 to 50, the U.S. is essentially taking care of matters in Japan solo. The United States is rebuilding Japan. They've gone in there, and Japan is starting to get back on its feet. And a key to this will be Japanese military orders during the Korean War. The Japanese produce much, if not, most, if not virtually all, of the weapons and military supplies for the Koreans, the South Koreans, the ROC Army in the Korean War. So the Korean War is really central to getting the Japanese economy back on its feet. But the United States has a larger goal, which is to reconnect Japan to Southeast Asia in a liberal world economy. All right? I mean, it's essentially the core and the periphery of Asia. Right? So this is a goal. The United States wants to wean Japan off American money and reconnect it to Southeast Asian economies. So on this issue then, the need for Southeast Asian markets, both the Japanese and the Europeans have a stake. As I said, it's kind of complicated, but it is important. Japanese profits would increase if they began to trade with other Asian nations, but so would European profits. Why? All right. Malaysia. Anybody know anything about Malaysia? Malaysia was a colony after World War II, belonging to the British. It was a British colony after World War II. Actually, the Dutch and Indonesia have a role in this too, but the British Malaysia is really the key to this. The British were deeply in debt. The British had a dollar gap, and Britain is America's biggest trading partner, so this is a problem. All right? Britain used to get a lot of dollars from Malaysia, but after World War II, the flow of dollars from Malaysia to Britain essentially stops. As a result, Britain begins to pour money, pounds sterling, into Malaysia to try to build it up. Right? They also want the Americans to start purchasing more goods from Malaysia. Why? What will that mean? If the United States purchases more goods from Malaysia, they will pay in dollars, and those dollars will go back to Britain, and Britain in turn can use those dollars to buy American goods. The United States recognizes this and begins purchasing more stuff from Malaysia and encouraging development. In fact, just down the road in Texas City, there was a synthetic tin factory that the American government essentially shut down because it was competing with Malaysian factories. So the U.S., I mean, this is not really liberalism. Liberalism is supposed to be free trade and competition. The U.S. essentially sees the need to rebuild Malaysia, get dollars into the hands of the British as being more important than maintaining jobs in Texas City. Okay? It gets to that point. One economist said a gradual transfer of aid from Western Europe to the underdeveloped areas such as Southeast Asia will contribute toward a solution of the dollar problems in both Europe and the underdeveloped areas. A vigorous foreign aid program is necessary for a prosperous America. Getting dollars into the hands of the Malaysians, which in turn will make it back to Britain, and in turn will be used to purchase American goods, becomes crucial. Now, what's the problem here? Malaysia has a rebellion going on, a communist rebellion there, right? And the United States is going to do everything it can to suppress it. What other area in Southeast Asia has a communist insurgency going on? Vietnam, okay? So Vietnam and Malaysia are similar. Both of them are crucial. In both areas, the United States sees potentially good markets for the Japanese to invest and for the Japanese to sell goods. All right? So Vietnam then becomes crucial for a couple reasons. First, it can provide raw materials and become a source of dollars for the French. If goods are purchased and sold in Vietnam, then that money eventually will make it back to France. And what will France do with those dollars? They'll buy American goods because there's a dollar gap. All right? In addition to that, the issue of communism is relevant too. because just as Malaysia had a communist insurgency, so too did Vietnam. Now, the Americans and the British may not have been enthused about France's return to Indochina, but even more than that, they wanted to make sure that Malaysia and Indochina did not fall into communist hands. So for that reason, for that larger reason, the United States supports the French return. Okay? So it's not really because of events in Vietnam that the United States gets involved for economic reasons, but it's the need for the Americans to develop a world economic system in which capitalist markets would be protected and nationalist or communist movements which threaten capitalism would be contained. So supporting Japan and trying to recreate capitalism in Asia becomes the reason for allowing or agreeing to the French going back into Vietnam. It is not a specific economic interest in the sense that we need trade there. It is a larger economic interest in that we need to create a liberal world in Asia, a global economy in Asia with global markets so we can get dollars into the hands of these people, which in turn will make it back to Europe, which in turn will be used to purchase American goods. All right? But anyway, I mean, it's not easy stuff, but it's not overwhelming either. Anybody have any questions on this? Good. I was afraid I'd have to. Yes?
Were there any contemporary arguments against this whole process?
Oh, Robert Taft and the isolationists, sure. They thought the United States should just worry about Europe, develop the economy at home. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's always been, just as globalization has been very common in the late 19th and mid-20th and again at the end of the 20th century, there have always been arguments against it too. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was this real sense that the United States was overextending itself. It was overreaching. A real isolationist argument about that the United States would become an imperial power. I mean, Henry Wallace, people like that, sure. Yeah.
Was this theory that you've just thrown out, was it popular back in the 60s? Or is this looking back 30 years? Well, let me expand on that. By that I mean that I think one of the reasons why a lot of people wanted to use economics as the excuse for the Vietnam War, and you get into the Oliver Stone theories that you can make more money selling guns at this time than you can anything else, and that was a sort of a crutch for the reason for a lot of people. But what you've just stated is something that's historically accurate. Was it discussed in the 60s?
Not a whole lot. I think in general, the Oliver Stone line about that, I mean, that's crazy. Military conspiracy and all that kind of stuff is just goofy. I mean, the United States could sell guns anywhere in the world and didn't need a war to sell a lot of guns. I mean, the United States sold more weapons after the Vietnam War ended than it did during the Vietnam War. In terms of this being kind of popular, not really that much. Some of the economic analyses of it, I mean, actually, I think were fairly accurate, but were fairly limited. You need stuff like tin and tungsten and American corporations and Dow and whatnot. I mean, I'm willing to say that I think that, once companies saw what they could do with regard to Vietnam, they certainly didn't hesitate to oppose it, But at the same time, this actually, the first person to really, I think, talk about this in this kind of a sophisticated manner was a guy named Andrew Rotter, who wrote a book in 1987 called The Path to Vietnam, which I think is wonderful. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read on this whole issue. And you have people like William Atman Williams, who was putting Vietnam within the larger context of global trade and the open door, although he didn't have the specificity of Rotter, talking about Malaysian markets and dollar gaps and things like that. But at the time when I think of the anti-war movement, I think of, well, people like Noam Chomsky, who's probably the most important intellectual of that period. I mean, Chomsky, again, was certainly putting it into the larger framework, but again, he didn't have, the documents that other people later would to talk about the dollar gap and, synthetic plants in Texas City and stuff like that. So I think, people like Chomsky, Gabriel Kolko, at the time understood this, but not in this kind of a specific way. And I know, I mean, a large part of the left was basically saw this in terms of the military-industrial complex, almost a conspiracy. Let's sell more weapons. Let's keep, this thing going and whatnot. And I just think that's kind of crazy. I mean, there's no evidence for that. And if they did, they're stupid because that's a bad economic. Going to war is never, it may for a short time, but as we'll see later on, I mean, it's actually Wall Street that turns on Vietnam. I would argue that Wall Street had more to do with ending the war than the anti-war movement did, which gets me in trouble with a lot of old friends from the anti-war movement because I think what they did was very valuable. But I think it tends to be this larger issue, which is really harder to get a handle on. I mean, Iran's pretty easy. It's oil. I mean, you don't need to have a sophisticated analysis of the open door to figure that out. Guatemala's not real hard. You see UFCO there. You see its connections. You see the land it holds. You can figure that out. And Vietnam's much harder to get a handle on because there's no particular interest that you can just identify and say, oh, Michelin rubber. That doesn't hold water at all. It really is part of this larger issue of regional integration and getting money into the hands of the Europeans. Was anybody saying this in the 60s? Not really. I don't think anybody really could give you this kind of a sophisticated analysis of it. Yeah.
When we look at the dollar gap, we're looking at a time period between 45 and 50 or after 50?
It continues really into the late 50s almost.
It began in the just post-World War II?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
Because Europe is devastated and,
Right.
and their economies are wrecked.
Right, and ours is quite the contrary. We're rocking and
Yeah,
rolling.
and, yeah, exactly. America's rock and roll, so it has to do everything it can. That's why it goes to NSC 68. Now, I would make something of almost a conspiratorial economic argument with regard to Korea. There's a guy, a couple people, one unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, fairly young, who were arguing that the United States essentially consciously, maybe deliberately, prolonged the Korean War in order to maintain military spending. And he doesn't really nail it down, but there's a lot there. I mean, there's something going on there. And I think Korea came along, if it wasn't planned, it came along at the perfect time because it justified this massive increase in defense spending. All right? So, but in Vietnam, I don't see anything like that. But the dollar gap continues, and that's why the United States has to find ways to spend money to keep the economy going. And that's why this military-industrial complex becomes so important. If you spend money on bridges and railroads and airports and schools and hospitals and healthcare, that kind of turns to redistributive politics where people get empowered. And I think there's a fear there. I mean, I think
There's no cash flow involved in that either. I mean, this whole thing is about cash
well, it's about
flow.
cash flow, but it's also about maintaining the position of a certain group of people, right? And so if you create, a really fantastic education system in which everybody, then people start to get ambitions. If you feed the poor, if you eliminate slums, then these people start to get expectations. And, I'm not sure that that's really what the people in charge want to see. They kind of like things the way it is. So there's this issue, as I said before, of containment at home as well. You want to contain groups at home from getting, really high, grand expectations. And this is, very few people agree with me on this one, but, I think it's worth pursuing. So that's why military spending is perfect. I mean, you can't oppose that, because if you oppose it in the 1950s, what's it mean? You're a communist. I mean, Joe McCarthy's perfect for this period, right? Right? So. All right. So I think all of these issues play into each other. Containment in Europe, communism in Asia, global capitalism. And for this reason, the United States will support France first in Indochina, and then after 1954, after Dien Bien Phu, the U.S. will increasingly take over and pay the bills. Okay? All right. So now we're moving on then to America's initial commitments in Vietnam. All right? And actually, again, I just have a couple photos here. Some of the key players in that. Harry Truman, to the left, President Harry Truman, and to the right, Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State. Acheson's really a character. His father was, I think, the Anglican Archbishop of somewhere in New England, Connecticut, or wherever, and really hoity-toity, upper elite types. And Acheson always fancied himself a British gentleman, and he walked around dressed like it and carried a cane and whatnot. Really incredibly arrogant, quite intelligent guy. And this is just a little photo image of Lieutenant Colonel A. Peter Dewey, whose claim to infamy, actually. He was the first American killed in Vietnam in 1945. He was in a Jeep, and the Viet Minh mistook him for a French officer, and he was killed. And I don't know, is Dewey's name on the wall? I don't think his name is on the wall, though. He's not the first one. It's the first one's like 58 or 59 or something like that. Yeah, so I don't know why that is. I guess so. Initial commitments. The United States, even though it kind of acquiesces in France's return after 45, doesn't do a whole lot to help the French. The war breaks out in 46, and France seems to have things under control. In 1950, the United States, for the first time, gets more deeply involved in Vietnam. it does this first by sending money. It sends about $25 million to Vietnam, to French Indochina, to help in the fight against the Viet Minh. And even more importantly, it pursues what comes to be known as the Bao Dai solution. And this is just a document here. It's a note from Dean Acheson. It's a statement of Dean Acheson talking about the need to support Vietnam. The United States recognizes that the solution to the Indochina problem depends upon the restoration of security and the development of genuine nationalism. Again, both sides are claiming nationalism. And the United States assistance can and should contribute to these major objectives. So this is the first, real statement that the United States will assist the Vietnamese. Now,
Can we see what you were just pointing
yeah,
at?
it's just a document. It's a statement by Dean Acheson in May of 1950. And, as often as possible, I will link up documents to this, okay? And so the United States, in order to assist the Vietnamese nationalists, isn't that kind of Orwellian, the way that they're going to assume the mantle of nationalism against the Viet Minh, decide to bring Bao Dai back. I mean, it's quite clear that the French control Indochina, and this looks bad, right? If the United States sends $25 million to the French in Indochina, what's that mean? The United States supports colonialism, right? I mean, they've been saying that they don't, and yet this is exactly what they do. So they have to somehow make this look like the Vietnamese are running their own country. Problem, you don't have anybody to do it, because who's the most popular guy in Vietnam? It's Ho Chi Minh, and the U.S. won't work with him. So they got to find somebody, right? So they find Bao Dai, right? I've mentioned Bao Dai before. I mean, first of all, he's in the Riviera. He's in the brothels. He's at the gaming tables, right? The guy's, he's dressed. He doesn't want to be back in Vietnam, so they return him to the Vietnamese throne. He's the guy who turned it over in August of '45 to Ho Chi Minh. Remember, he invested him. He gave him the imperial sword, and he was on the next plane to Paris, right? So, the last thing he needs is this kind of headache, but there's nobody else. So in 1950, the United States goes for the Bao Dai solution. He'd rather be playing Baccarat. He'd rather be escorting Marilyn Monroe lookalikes around, but he's returned. He's brought back, okay? And so the United States now has a government, a Vietnamese government it can support. And this looks a lot better, right? It doesn't have the same colonial taint. So the United States begins sending money. And in 1950, $25 million. In 1951, $130 million. And again, that's not an insignificant amount of money in 1951. But even more importantly, this is an area that no one knew. I mean, no one could have found on a map 10 years earlier. Now you're sending $130 million, which means that the U.S. is taking it fairly seriously. Again, within the larger context of making France happy and keeping the Japanese from being encircled by communist countries. All right? The Vietnamese attach great importance to this American support, more than the Americans did. I don't think the Americans understood just how important this appropriation of over $100 million was, but the Vietnamese did. General Giap said, the aggressive war waged by the French colonialists gradually became a war carried out with U.S. dollars and French blood. It was really a dirty war. When the Americans began supporting the French, the Viet Minh saw this as a huge, huge development. I mean, they anticipated a U.S. takeover of the war. The Americans are kind of saying, no, this is just we're just helping the French out. It's limited. We're never going to. And the Vietnamese see it coming. They're actually far more prophetic and aware of what's going on than the Americans are. So the United States then takes these steps, these initial steps, and through 50, 51, 52, begins to send more and more money. By 1953, the United States is sending $785 million. This is an economic aid to Vietnam. It's also sending over technicians, mechanics, a fairly limited military contingent, but nonetheless some, kind of advisor types are going over. About 200, I believe, at one point. And as we'll see very briefly, this is something the military is not terribly happy about. Okay, so the United States recognizes Bao Dai's government. It sends increasing levels of support to Vietnam. It starts to send very limited numbers of technicians and military officers. It establishes something called the, which I actually should have had up here, probably should have been on the outline. It establishes something called the MAAG, the MAAG. This stands for Military Assistance Advisory Group. Okay? It's called US MOG VN, United States MAG Vietnam, but the MOG is it's referred to. And the idea here is that we will assist and advise the Vietnamese, but not more than that. Okay? 50. Yeah, I think the MOG is actually established in 50 or 51, 1950. And it goes really until 62 when it's reestablished as MACV, yeah. Right. So the United States makes this commitment, it establishes this group. The Korean War is also important with regard to Vietnam. Once the war in Korea breaks out, Vietnam becomes more important. You know, oh Jesus, you know, people start to see this Korean action as part of a global attack. You know, first China, then Korea, Vietnam. We better make a stand somewhere, all right? And then, like I said, by 1953, the U.S. commitment is quite significant, $785 million.
You know, if we could, can we backtrack just
Sure.
a little bit? I mean,
Sure.
you basically made a pretty sophisticated argument based on economics for U.S. increasing involvement in Southeast Asia. And I don't disagree with anything you said. It all makes sense. But at the same time, looking at it from the point of view of an average American person following World War II, I think people had an ideological reason to oppose communism. Not simply because they were McCarthyites who found communists under every bed, but because they saw that communism was making the people who lived in those systems unhappy. Stalin had created a totalitarian system that was inflicting terror on its own citizens comparable to what Hitler did. And people, I think, in America felt, rightly or wrongly, that they were legitimately helping the Koreans and the Vietnamese to not adopt this system of government. You know, true, people at the highest levels of international industry might have had their own game plan going on, but in terms of the average American people, it's not that they were total dupes of capitalist propaganda. They could see for themselves that these systems weren't working in the Soviet Union. And you had the Hungarian Revolt in 1956. People wanted out of that way of government who'd already had it. Can we really ignore that?
Well, no, and I'm not ignoring it. I think there's a difference, though, when you deal with people who are actually making policy and the way policy is disseminated publicly. I mean, one thing, you know, you kept talking about the Soviet Union, and I probably agree with your characterization of it for the most part, but Vietnam's not the Soviet Union. And in fact, most people don't know anything about Vietnam. So, I mean, policy is made for particular reasons at the top level. And with regard to Vietnam, nobody really cares about it enough, quite frankly. I mean, I'm not being cynical here, it's just that's basically, if you look at American documents at the time, nobody cares about it enough to really care whether Ho Chi Minh is enslaving the people, which is the rhetoric they use. All right. The point is that France is there, Japan is there, we have these other interests. Now, when you start talking about it publicly, yeah, the way you're going to do it is you're going to say, we're going to save these people from communist enslavement. And with regard to Stalinist Russia, you know, yeah, you're right, there are gulags and there are, you know, forced collectivizations and things like that. But it's harder to find that in a place like Vietnam.
But I think that's how people felt about South Korea. And then 10 years later, when the U.S. involvement in Vietnam is increasing, that was, I think, how a lot of people looked at Vietnam.
It was sold that way, yeah, a lot of people looked at it that way, but I'm not sure how well it took, because at the same time that's happening, when we get to the Diem regime, you know, basically the story becomes, well, the other side's doing stuff that's just as bad, probably worse. So it's really much harder for them to say, we're saving Vietnam from the communists, when this country, you know, this group you're supporting, our sons of bitches. That's why I brought that up earlier. I mean, part of it is, I mean, George McT. Kane, who's written great stuff about Vietnam, sees it in terms of anti-communism. That, you know, the United States identified Ho Chi Minh as a communist and opposed him for that reason. But at the same time, there are a fair number of people who are saying, let's treat Ho Chi Minh, a term you quite often see, as an Asian Tito. Remember, you know, Tito in Yugoslavia, the United States actually, you know, negotiates and recognizes. And so there are people, Maxwell Taylor, who was, you know, the Army Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Ambassador to Saigon, uses this term. Let's treat him as an Asian Tito. You know, he's different. So, I mean, on one level, yeah, there's clearly an anti-communist, approach that you can't talk about anything in the Cold War without taking an anti-communism. I probably took it for granted there. Dylan said, took too much for granted. I got my signals crossed. But at the same time, I think that the way policy is formulated and the way it's disseminated often varies. So, clearly the United States is going to say, yes, we're doing this for freedom and anti-communism and whatnot. But in fact, the guys they're supporting are probably worse.
I guess my point was, if you take the contradictions between America's professed ideals and its role in the 20th century as an economic empire, if you put that aside, there still were very good reasons for being anti-communist from the point of view.
Well, for being anti-Soviet, maybe. Or being, but that's a blanket statement. That assumes that everybody who assumed the mantle of socialism or communism did it the same way. And I think that, look at the four major communist revolutions, the Bolsheviks, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the Cubans. And they're way different. You can find, huge disparities there in them. Frankly, I can look at the Vietnamese and Cuban revolutions, not necessarily the way they turned out, and see, great promise there at certain points, whereas less so with Stalin. So, I think it's legitimate. At the same time, though, that assumes that any of this was done with any kind of real public fanfare, and that's really not the case. Dien Bien Phu was a headline when Dien Bien Phu fell. Other than that, most people this just wasn't an issue. If you look at the New York Times index for Vietnam, there's just very few entries in it. It just wasn't an area of much interest to people, and Ho Chi Minh, yeah, when they wrote it up, Ho Chi Minh was a communist and whatnot, but it just wasn't really a vital concern. And when it finally becomes a vital concern, the government really has a tough time selling Ho because he had so cleverly assumed the Uncle Ho mantle as this communist dictator, especially when compared to the Ziems, the Ngo family, the Ziem regime. So, I think you're right. Anything done in that period has strong anti-communist overtones to it. But when you look at the reason for American involvement, it has to do with much larger issues in the late 40s and early 50s. Things like France and Japan and all this other stuff. But at the same time, there's also what I'll talk about later. I think McCarthyism has a lot to do with it too. There's this real fear that if we don't do something there, we're going to be perceived as soft on communism. The other thing that, when I get to the next point, I think this is important too, because this is based on my own work. When you see the way the military looked at Vietnam, I think that's important too. Because if one would presume that if any group would be kind of gung-ho about getting involved there and killing commies, it would be the brass and the services, and they weren't. They weren't at all. But, I think you're right. There's no question. There are a lot of people who do operate, their public decisions operate based on anti-communism. But I think specifically with regard to Vietnam, it's harder to see that. Even in Korea, I'm not sure, how much you saw, because again, Syngman Rhee was certainly no prince. Remember Reagan tried to pull that in the 80s with Nicaragua and El Salvador, and the American people never really bought it. 2/3 of Americans tended to oppose that. So I don't think the American people are dupes. In fact, I think the opposite. I think they're fairly sophisticated. And I think that generally, whenever they would hear that, they would kind of wonder what the case was. And by the time the U.S. tries to make this public case about, Ho Chi Minh being this Stalinist, most people ain't buying it. It just never really went over that well. But, at the same time, yeah, if you accept the idea that this is, Stalinist Russia in an Asian setting, then sure, yeah, you should support intervention. Sure, that I can understand why people would say that. But again, I'm not sure that, anybody really tried to make the case of Ho Chi Minh. It was harder to do. Stalin was a pretty easy call. Ho was harder to do in the unique situation of Vietnam. So, but that's you see that rhetoric publicly, right? And Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, when he becomes Secretary of State, uses it all the time. Dulles has this real kind of millenarian view of the world. The communists are out to attack us and this and that. And in 1954, there's a conference in Geneva, which I'll talk about, and he turns his back on Zhou Enlai, and he won't talk to any of the Vietnamese delegates there. He just won't even have anything to do with them. So yeah, there's clearly that aspect, and Dulles, more than anybody, uses this rhetoric, and Dean Acheson did, and John Kennedy does. So there's clearly that element of it. But I'm not sure, at the top levels how important that is. Right? So by the 50s, the United States is really deeply involved. But it's involved, it perceives, indirectly. It doesn't anticipate getting involved to the point where it actually has to send troops to Vietnam. Mostly it's writing checks and sending advisors and things like that. All right. At this time, quite ironically though, there's one group in the American government which is very reluctant to make a commitment to Vietnam, and that is the U.S. military. And this is the subject of my own research, and this is why it really interested me. I had always assumed that people in uniform were, kind of like Slim Pickens or Sterling Hayden in Strangelove, and actually, I found out that there were a good number of military leaders who were very critical of the war, especially in the later 1960s. Some very well-known military leaders. And this kind of prompted me to go back and look at the way the military perceived Vietnam from the beginning. And what I found was that there was really no great interest in getting involved in Vietnam, no overriding concern for communism in Vietnam. Okay, that's the wrong thing. To find the right stuff that I underlined. In fact, in the 1950s, from 50 to 54, from the time the U.S. recognizes Bao Dai through the Dien Bien Phu, the United States makes a series of commitments to Vietnam, and at each point, the military is very reluctant to go as far as the civilians are, and quite often critical of the American involvement in Vietnam. And I think this kind of gets back to that whole issue of remember these things we talked about. People who are making policy tend to have fairly global visions of the world. They identify the national interest in a much larger way. I mean, they can see the interconnections between capitalism in Japan and the markets of Southeast Asia and the dollar gap in ways that people in uniform are capable of but don't have to. I mean, guys in uniform are smart enough to figure that out, but that's not their job. Their goal is to protect American security. They perceive it as being kind of a defensive role, a security role. So their view of the interests of the United States are going to be much narrower than the civilians are. So a lot of civilians are going to look at America and think that it can do anything anywhere. And because of that, you see this incredible series of commitments and regional alliances and NATO and CETO, which we'll talk about, and all kinds of stuff like that. Military sees things differently. It sees the United States as having a limited role. The United States has to be limited by its resources, by its interests, and it has to create, priorities. And within that context, Vietnam is never a priority to people within the military, and for a lot of reasons. First, I think better than anybody, because they were on the field and they actually knew many of the Viet Minh, American military officials recognized that the fight against the French was not a fight of communist versus good Vietnamese per se, which is the way the Americans were trying to portray it. But in fact, this was a long historical conflict, that in fact there was a legitimate and widespread distrust of the French, and the French were in fact brutal and repressive, so that even though Ho Chi Minh may have been a communist, I think military people in Vietnam understood that this was a war of national liberation more than anything else. Right? So they understand the kind of domestic or the indigenous political implications of it better than do any of the military, the civilian people. All right? They also understand, connected to that the Viet Minh are more popular, that Ho Chi Minh is more popular, they're stronger, but they also have greater public support, right? Military people see the possibility of Soviet and Chinese aid, which means that this could get bigger. And finally, there's kind of the military aspect of it. American soldiers are not trained for guerrilla wars in jungles. Right? I mean, they had done some of that in World War II, and it wasn't, wasn't the best that it could have been. So, once the military looks at Vietnam, it tends to keep events there at an arm's length at least. It's quite afraid, in fact, of getting too deeply involved. And you can see this from the end of World War II onward. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, right after World War II, 1945, said that Vietnam was not included within the sphere of interest of the American Chiefs of Staff. It's just not really an issue there. As I said before, OSS agents, Alice and Thomas, most notably, had worked with Ho Chi Minh, Archimedes Patty also. And they were actually quite close, and they lobbied the U.S. government to support them. General Philip Gallagher, who was the American representative to the Chinese forces in the north, said that, confidentially, I wish the Annamites, the Viet Minh, could be given their independence. So again, the American military was on, fairly positive, had a fairly positive relationship with the Viet Minh. And in fact, in 1949, in what I think was a very prophetic document, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, the widening political consciousness and the rise of militant nationalism among the subject people will not be crushed by Western arms. They're not talking about communism, they're talking about nationalism, and they use the term subject people.
Who said that?
This is the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. It cannot be reversed. Indo-Chinese nationalism is a force that cannot be reversed, and this is, I think, quite striking that the JCS would say this. To attempt to do this, to attempt to go in and defeat the Viet Minh, this is what the JCS says, would be an anti-historical act, likely in the long run to create more problems than it solves and cause more damage than benefit. This is in 1949, which is just stunningly prophetic. This is the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Is that a memo intergovernment that has since been made public, or was that a public statement?
No, it was not a public statement, no. No, rarely. I mean, it's, military culture, you don't. It's a funny cartoon I once saw, two guys walking out of a meeting, it says JCS meeting, and it says, I like the way you stood up to the general, private, which is kind of the way, you don't do that. No, it was a doc. I mean, it was directed to the Secretary of State. So, I mean, actually at the time George Marshall was Secretary of State, later Secretary of Marshall agreed with it. Marshall was the most prestigious military man going at the time, and his statements were always very critical of intervention in Vietnam, too. I mean, Marshall opposed the return of Bao Dai. When the United States goes for the Bao Dai solution, Marshall said, what kind of a message does it send that we have to go find this playboy emperor in France to come back and run Vietnam? It makes us look like fools. It makes us look like we're the French colonialists all over again. Right? As I said before, the Army sends intelligence officers out to kind of get the lay of the land, and they come back with a report that says 80% of the Vietnamese people support Ho Chi Minh, but 80% of those supporters are not communists. So it's a front, it's a popular movement. So again, I mean, if you want to try to sell this as an anti-communist crusade, it's just a lot harder to do in Vietnam. Despite that, the United States continues to send money to Vietnam. However, American officers in country continued to see problems there. In late 1950, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee, which is a wing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says it's in the American military interest to minimize commitments to Indochina. And this is something that's important too, and you'll see this time and again. Even token support carries great danger, as the circumstances under which pressures may force further commitments are so numerous, and the possibility of one or more pressures building up is so great that additional commitments could not be prevented. And you'll see this time and again, this idea that even if we send token support, it's going to mean that we've anteed up. And once you've done that, it's going to be harder to pull out. And you're going to start giving more and more commitments and doing more and more stuff. And this is something the military is always afraid of, making that initial commitment. That's why I call this the can't-do spirit. In the military, you're supposed to have the can-do spirit. In fact, in Vietnam, it's can't-do. We can't do it. We shouldn't do it. All right? In addition to that, the U.S. recognizes the Viet Minh's strength, ultimately up to 340,000 troops. In addition to that, they also see that the French are not terribly competent. J. Lawton Collins, in 1950, was the Army Chief of Staff, a World War II hero, Lightning Joe Collins, said in 1950, quite bluntly, again, quite prophetically, France will be driven out of Indochina, and it's wasting men and equipment trying to remain there. The American military, even though the United States acquiesces to the French return because it has these greater concerns, the military takes the opposite approach. Europe is more important, and we got to get the French out of Vietnam. We need them in Europe. We need them fighting the communists on the front of the Cold War. We don't need them in Vietnam. No one cares about Vietnam. Right? Ho Chi Minh's just fine there. I mean, the military all but takes a pro-Ho Chi Minh view of things. It's quite striking at times, the stuff they say about him. I mean, you don't get you know, these people are very close. They see what's happening there. And you don't get a lot of negative reports about the Viet Minh, which is really quite remarkable. I mean, I've seen basically every document that was out there, you know, the Pentagon Papers, and you read all this stuff. And you don't see a whole lot of stuff that's terribly negative about the Viet Minh. You get it about Diem later on, but not so much the other side. And in fact, you know, when they look at the situation there, they tend to have a very negative view of prospects in Vietnam. All right. So whenever the French ask for more money or ask for greater support, the military opposes it. It doesn't really matter much. I mean, they tend to lose this because the way the system is set up, obviously the civilians are going to have more power. But every time the French show up, they tend to leave with more aid. And the Americans are always upset about that. In fact, at one point, Omar Bradley, the last five-star general, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says, I don't think we can get the public to go along with our idea of going into Indochina in a military way. So again, he's understanding. The people are opposed to it, in fact. Okay? J. Lawton Collins said, we have to face the probability that Indochina will be lost. Okay? Another group, the Joint Strategic Plans Committee, said, even if we send token support to Vietnam, it'll lead to a dilemma similar to that in Korea, which is unsolvable by military action. At NATO, Dwight Eisenhower, who would soon become president, was opposed to the commitment of any ground troops. Somebody had written this in. Was that you on the thing? Yeah, I mean, Eisenhower was opposed to the introduction of ground troops. Ike kind of goes both ways. On one hand, he opposes ground troops. On the other hand, he doesn't really pull the rug out either. Other generals say that we can't fight there because the terrain is bad. We don't know how to fight guerrilla wars. The Viet Minh are popular. You're sending all this money. And General Hoyt Vandenberg says aid to Vietnam is like pouring money down a rat hole. So you see this then time and again, the military displaying this can't-do spirit. And this really comes to a head in '54 during the Dien Bien Phu crisis when the French suggest that the Americans should help them out, should send perhaps naval or air support. Rumors of asking for the atomic bomb, I don't think that really happened. I don't think those have ever been proven with documents. But clearly the French wanted the U.S. to bail them out. And it was the military which rejected that. No way. You know, this is stupid. We don't have the resources for it. Who cares? Let them lose. It's good for them. Get out of Vietnam, get back to Europe, and worry about that. Right? So next time we'll pick up on this, finish this up, and head into the situation in North and South Vietnam, the Diem era, and so forth.